Okay, so Penny Ehrhardt is our guest for our next session here. Penny is a legal theorist and a public policy consultant. Penny's research interests include the practice and implementation of policymaking, things like social movements, international human rights, gender, the family and the state, queer theory, and treaty issues. Penny is a senior associate at the Institute for Governance and Policy Studies in the School of Government at Victoria University of Wellington, New Zealand, and a non-practising barrister and solicitor of the High Court of New Zealand. She served on the Secretariat supporting the Ministerial Expert Advisory Group on the electoral law reform referendum at the New Zealand Ministry of Justice. Now, Penny will speak about the impacts of replacing first past the post with mixed member proportional on democracy, the impacts of that on democracy in New Zealand, and how proportional representation enabled a strong cooperative response to the current pandemic. So thank you very much, Penny. It's very exciting to hear what you have to say. Well, of course, again, we'll have some questions at the end. We'll collect those. But take it away, and thanks again for being with us today.
Oh, look, thank you so much for having me on. I'm absolutely delighted to be here speaking to you about a topic that's pretty dear to my heart. So I'm just pulling up the PowerPointers at the moment. There we go. I'm going to be flicking between the slides and my just video as we go, so it's not just all staring at slides. But yes, it's wonderful to be here, and I'm hoping you're having a great conference. Some of the stuff you probably know. I'm just going to do a whistle-stop tour through the history of MMP and then get into more of the issues. So New Zealand demography, the population is just hit 5 million, of whom just under 65% are New Zealand or European. And the largest minority is the Indigenous people, who are the Maori people, and who have a significant political place in the way the country runs. We're a unicameral parliamentary democracy, which means we have one House of Parliament, which in some ways makes the system simpler than many countries. And of course, it's the MMP electoral system. So the first thing I wanted to do was to show you a little video that, sorry, excuse me one moment.
Take your time, Penny.
Yeah, no worries. Oh, here we go.
Set up the screen share for a little video describing New Zealand's mixed member proportional system.
Thank you so much, Anna. And so here we go. This is just giving you a bit of intro to the New Zealand system for those who don't know.
The screen share is not on.
Ah, thank you so much. That's not helping, is it? Okay, I'm so sorry about this.
That's all right. Everyone's very patient. It only takes a minute to sort it out, we're sure. So we did test this before the call, everyone. It does work. Just give Penny a minute.
It does work. It just takes, as you said, takes a second.
So once you've got the video on the YouTube page, like share screen.
Actually, I'm so sorry. I'm trying to get back to the Zoom call, which has vanished from my. Could we just take a pause while I actually get back onto the video of the call? Sorry, maybe someone else can fill the space.
There's a lot of appreciation for your joining us at 7 a.m. New Zealand time. So I think you're functioning better than most of us would at 7 a.m.
Thank you so much. We're getting there. So I believe we now have the share screen up. Is that correct?
We do. We do.
Oh, great. Okay, so this little clip, just to start again, is produced by our Electoral Commission to explain MMP to New Zealand voters.
Of seats each party will have of the 120 seats in Parliament. If 40% of us vote for the Cherry Party, it will get around 40% of all the seats in Parliament. If 10% of us vote for the Pear Party, it will get about 10% of the seats. Your second vote is to choose a person to represent your local electorate in Parliament. Under MMP, New Zealand is divided into 71 electorates. Whoever gets the most votes will become your local MP. They don't have to get more than half the votes to win. To get any seats in Parliament, a party must reach at least 5% of the party vote or win an electorate seat. So let's see what can happen. The Cherry Party has won 25% of the party vote, which is equal to 30 seats in Parliament. These are filled firstly by the electorate seats they won, and the rest by MPs from its party list. The Pear Party hasn't won any electorate seats, but because it won 10% of the party vote, it's entitled to 10% of all the seats in Parliament. All come from its party list. The Banana Party only won 4% of the party vote, which is under the 5% threshold. But because they won one electorate, they are entitled to 4% of all the seats in Parliament. As its name says, MMP is a proportional system. This means there is likely to be a range of big and small parties in Parliament. Under the MMP voting system, governments are usually made up of more than one party, in coalition or with support agreements. And that's MMP.
And that is how the New Zealand government explains the electoral system to the people of New Zealand. You'll notice the little orange person and the orange colouring throughout. That has been the logo, the representative colours branding for MMP since the beginning, which it's kind of weird, I know, but it sort of works because it does allow everyone to know that this is about the election, and there's good buy-in for that being the information, how you find information about the electoral system. So how did New Zealand get here? Well, just going back to the beginning of our universal suffrage.
And I'll share. Okay, slides are coming back up.
No, the slides are fine. It was, sorry about that. It was purely the video that was a little difficult. So basically, from 1893, New Zealand's had universal adult suffrage. Back then, like in many countries, it really was a electoral constituency-based system where political parties weren't really a thing, and so you did vote for the man for the job. But throughout most of the 20th century, it became a two-party system. I like this image. I found it from a news site called Spin-Off, and it goes through showing how the proportions in Parliament have changed over the years. So the electoral system continues and becomes a strongly two-party system from the 1930s onwards. One party won an absolute majority of the seats in Parliament, and it basically swapped between National and Labour. But of course, as I'm sure you know, the winner does not have to have a majority of the votes. And in fact, from 1960 to 1993, no government had the voting support of a majority of New Zealanders. By 1978, there were a couple of things that showed up that really highlighted some of the problems. In 1978 and 1981, the Labour Party won a majority of the votes in Parliament, but in fact the National Party won a majority of the votes in New Zealand, but because the National Party won a majority of the seats, National retained power. So that was number one issue. And number two issue that people had problems with was a third party seen here as the little tiny orange sliver. The Social Credit Party had considerable electorate support, considerable support across New Zealand, but was only able to win one seat and then two seats. So that was problematic, obviously, to many people who were beginning to say that the system was unfair. They didn't like being in the majority of people and yet not being able to form the government, having a minority actually making up the government. And so the Labour Party made an election promise that they'd have a royal commission on the electoral system. And they got into power, and in 1986, they held this commission, which recommended the MMP system, but subject to a referendum that the commission said should happen by the 1987 election. It didn't. And so in the following Labour government, the Prime Minister, so in the lead up to the following election, the Prime Minister, David Lange, promised to hold a referendum. And I know referendums have been a contentious topic in Canada. In New Zealand, it's the way that MMP has come in.
Penny, can I ask, are there still slides that you're speaking to? Because they've disappeared.
No, I've turned the slides off because I just feel it's a
just
bit
checking.
Much serious. But thank you. No, I will put the slides back on, but thank you for checking. Yeah, so basically this was a very unique government where Labour had been elected to power and then ditched many of the economic policies they'd campaigned on, which were quite left-wing, being a Labour Party, and moved to neoliberal economic position. It caused enormous upheaval in New Zealand society. And within the Labour caucus, splits obviously were showing. So although the Prime Minister announced that there would be this referendum, he did not have the support of the majority of his caucus. And in fact, when Labour were re-elected, they reneged on this election promise, which really gave a good opportunity. It sounds like a bad thing, but to highlight their differences, the National Party, who could not really distinguish themselves from Labour on economic grounds because Labour had taken National's economic space. So one of the election promises National thought they could offer was that they'd have a referendum on the electoral system. And they did. It was carried out. It was a non-binding referendum, but it was a clear result, and the Labour Party leader at the time, Lange being no longer in that position, Mike Moore was now in this position, and his comment was, the people didn't speak on Saturday, they screamed, which was an expression of some of the upset and sense of betrayal many of the electorate felt about the state of politics and the state of Parliament in New Zealand at the time. So the following year, a binding referendum resulted in MMP being introduced, and we had our first MMP election in 1996, and I can say it was pretty exciting. As was mentioned, in my very first professional job, I was actually in the Secretariat that was assisting the expert group advising on these referendums. So it was something I was interested in, and then also got to have an insider's view on pretty early on, which was exciting. So moving on. So after 24 years, oh, sorry, I skipped over one. So carrying on the visual history of New Zealand, after this exciting time with this referendum, you can see that the parliamentary landscape changed dramatically straight away from 1996. Two important things. One is that there's a great deal more diversity and becomes a lot more interesting to look at this visual. But the other thing is it didn't actually become chaotic. In fact, it's still a largely two-party system. It's just that the additional parties get a look in. An MMP has proved to be successful for a number of reasons. Changing parliamentary behaviour, bringing parliamentary representation to the vast majority of New Zealanders, rather than a significant proportion who voted for minor parties being completely disenfranchised. And it also has allowed for there to be a break on the kind of extreme policy swings, such as the one that the 1984 Labour government undertook. And after 24 years, it's still got a great deal of support. It's bedded into a mature modern system that really gives our parliament a degree of legitimacy for a diverse world. So we're 24 years old, and we have really the three things that I wanted to highlight: dialogue, diversity, and stability. In terms of the first, why does MMP promote dialogue? And does it? Well, actually, there's been research that supports that members of parliament are actually using less hostile words to each other over the time, and that there's a more cooperative sense in parliament. And really this is, I say, because every party is in a situation of potentially needing to work with anyone else. Now you can of course reject other potential coalition partners or other supply partners out of hand before an election if you feel that your views are so different from theirs. However, you may still want to work with that party on some issue that you happen to agree on when you haven't got the support of all the other partners. So you have to think as you talk to your colleagues in Parliament, whatever party they're in, that you may need to have a working relationship with them. It doesn't mean that all parties are cozy with each other, but what it does mean is a degree of professional decorum is expected, and that this kind of schoolyard antics that can go on in Parliament are discouraged because you don't want those kind of petty fallings outs to occur. And the lead up to the latest election, the 2017 election, gives an example of what happens when a party gets it wrong. In the lead up to that election, the National Party, who had been the major party in government, had led the government, had a feeling that they would like to try and go it almost alone with only one coalition partner, the very small ACT Party. But to do this, they would needed to drive down a vote for the third party, New Zealand First. So they launched an aggressive campaign against the New Zealand First Centrist Party, which got quite nasty, including Winston Peters, the head of New Zealand, the leader of New Zealand First's private superannuation documents making their way into the public sphere, for example. Winston Peters is a man who's very concerned about his honour, and he didn't take well to that at all. What actually happened in the event of the election is, as so often happens with New Zealand First and Peters, he managed to pull one out of the bag and they were returned to Parliament. But he was in no mood to negotiate with the National Party. So the National Party thought that they were going to get to form the government because they had the most seats in Parliament and they'd been the government, and there was a big celebration. But, and I'll come back to this later, you need to have friends. Without friends, and without a good relationship, it's very hard to build a coalition. And so I think that was an example that's been learned from what happens when one is not cooperative, and politicians tend to be pretty speedy learners on some degrees, and the greater dialogue, the cross-party talks is definitely one of the benefits of MMP, which I can highly recommend. And our response to the COVID crisis here in New Zealand has got a lot of attention worldwide. We're in the wonderful position of only having one active COVID case in New Zealand currently, despite active testing, contact tracing, etc. So, thanks for putting up the study link. That's wonderful. Yes, so there are a number of reasons why we've been so successful, but one that's been highlighted around the world is leadership and is our government's response. And part of that is the fact that they're used to dialoguing across the different parties, and so we actually have our committee in charge of the COVID response until last week was led by the leader of the opposition National Party, which meant that the committee was having broad discussion across all parties prior to making many of the major decisions, and there was wide buy-in. This is a model that's evolved over MMP, and I don't know how important select committees are in your environment. Under the first past the post system in New Zealand, a select committee seemed to be almost a rubber stamp. You had the majority for a bill, it went to that committee, there was the performance of people giving submissions and arguments, but the numbers meant that that it was usually an almost foregone conclusion what the outcome would be. Moreover, the majority of important select committees would have a government majority and a government leadership. With the more diverse parliament, this no longer happens, and a number of select committees may be chaired by opposition MPs and by members of supply agreement parties, by parties other than the most dominant party in government. And they really do scrutinise legislation to a greater degree, and we've seen a lot more reports back coming out of select committee that have recommended changes to bills, or that select committees conducting investigations and reporting back in a way that wasn't happening before. And also it gives a role, I think, to, I mean, the role of the loyal opposition is of course important, but it gives more of a real role in Parliament to MPs who are not on the front benches, who are not in Cabinet on the opposition front bench, because the select committee work is now considered to be of much greater importance than it used to be. So the second positive outcome that I've highlighted is diversity, which is one of the obvious ones and probably behind some of my initial support for the change when it was going through. So parliamentary diversity has increased markedly in terms of gender, race, sexual orientation, religion, and as well as political opinion, of course. So Māori, for example, had previously been limited to supporting Labour. There was, in the 1930s, rapport was struck between a major Māori religious and political protest group, the Ratana Church, and the Labour Party, and that existed, which meant that when a Labour government acted in ways that Māori didn't find was supportive of their aspirations, they had nowhere to go because they were still a minority within the government. With MMP, they had much greater bargaining power, and this became apparent when the Clark Labour government made a couple of missteps, which were interpreted by many Māori as taking their vote for granted. So a cabinet minister, Tariana Turia, left the Labour government and co-founded the Māori Party, which initially was a broad-based party representing Māori interests that got into Parliament through our Māori electorate seats, which I won't go into, but may come up in the chat. So they did get into Parliament, and they actually went into coalition, to many people's surprise, with the National Party, which is equivalent to a Conservative Party and who they did not have a historic alliance to. Part of that was bad blood between the Clark Labour Party and the Māori Party. But, yeah, the split, in the sense of betrayal, made working relationships difficult. But also it was quite strategic, because by going into government, the Māori Party was able to influence not the whole tenor of government policy, but get through a couple of policies that were particularly important to them, such as the concept of whānau ora, which is, I guess, a social development approach based on supporting the extended family and empowering extended family groups or small tribal groups. They did also work to moderate government plans which they perceived as negative to Māori. So from within the government, they had a voice at the cabinet table, and that was their reasons for saying why they went into government with National. In terms of stability, the third point I was making, you'll remember I said that the 1984 Labour government's abandonment of traditional Labour economic policy and move to a neoliberal stance was a major motivator of MMP. It meant that people who didn't agree with that neoliberal stance had nowhere to go, because the only way to go in a binary system was further to the right, to the National Party. So that kind of extreme policy swing has not happened since MMP. In coalition, the different parties put a brake on each other. For example, at present, we have three parties, two in coalition, Labour and New Zealand First, supported by the Greens. Now, New Zealand First tend to be seen as more centrist and nationalist. The Greens are definitely to the left of the Labour Party. By both working with the Labour Party, I mean, everyone complains that they didn't get everything they wanted, but it does definitely mean that anything that the Greens are proposing that New Zealand First doesn't like. We couldn't have a green revolution at present, which some of you might regret, but it's a democracy. We also couldn't have, say, a huge swing to nationalism and anti-immigration, because that would never happen. It wouldn't happen for Labour, and it wouldn't happen for the Greens. And if Labour was to abandon their political platform and go for something completely else, their coalition agreements would be, and supply agreements would be in the waste bin. So they also have a break on what they can do. There does seem to be greater continuity between governments, because we can have a party that is a minor party supporting different governments. For example, the United Future Party, which no longer exists, but their stance was they would support the largest party in Parliament. They took that view, and they wanted to put themselves in the centre as a continuity stabilising force, which is what they did for a number of parliamentary terms. So there's also been stability in the government in the terms of the governments not falling. MMP politicians have had to learn to negotiate, and one of the key things there has been realising that coming up to an election, minor parties that have been in government or supported the government risk being wiped out if they've lost too much of their identity. So finding ways for them to express points of difference without breaking the coalition has been one of the learnings of MMP. And all of these three factors really give more legitimacy to the Parliament and to our system of government. So voter turnout in the last election was 79.8%, and in a 2011 referendum on the electoral system, checking in how people were finding it, 57.8% of voters favoured retaining MMP. This also can be seen in the COVID response, where it's been important that the majority of New Zealanders are accepting of the slogans, we're all in this together, we're a team of 5 million, and that the government speaks for them when they speak. Of course, that doesn't mean there's no concerns. So to some of the concerns that were expressed when MMP came in, and I believe maybe expressed in your setting, what about voter understanding? What about extremists, queen makers, party hacks, lazy MPs, or paralysis? So in terms of voter understanding, it's important to note that voters are smarter than we often think. And I'm just going to put up a few of the ads from some of the parties, because as well as the strong advertising from the Electoral Commission, which we saw with the orange man who I showed you at the start, we also have political parties themselves are keen to educate voters. So this one was hastily put together by the Labour Party following their change of leadership just before the election. Features the head of the Labour Party, of course, Jacinda Ardern, and says in the corner, party vote Labour. So that's getting across the message that the party vote is going to be the one that creates the government. The Green Party, this is from a couple of elections ago, tried to abandon such a focus on parliamentary personalities, and a lot of their billboards featured Kiwi kids, highlighting the looking to the future. And again, the message is party vote Green. The Greens knew they were extremely unlikely to win the electorate seats, so for them it was vitally important to emphasise the party vote. Of course, many ads did feature the electorate MPs. This one from National has 2 MPs, the electorate MP Paula Bennett, plus one of their list MPs, Tau Henare, arguing that in West Auckland they could benefit from voting 2 ticks for National, 2 ticks for your party is one of the main campaign slogans, and they would get more representation from passionate Westies. New Zealanders have shown themselves to be able to absorb this message. This obviously it's a little complex, and I'm not expecting people to read all of the detail, but it's another spin-off graphic that shows the way votes were split. The vast majority of people voted for the party whose electorate candidate they also supported. And that's particularly true for the major parties, National and Labour. Of the people who voted for party vote for one of the smaller ones, such as the Greens, New Zealand First or TOP, they were much less likely to give their party vote to that candidate. Although in the Greens, you've got the interesting situation where some Greens party vote Greens will vote for a Labour candidate, some Labour party voters will vote for a Green candidate. So people have made different decisions, but it does indicate that there's a reasonable understanding of what they're doing. The issue of extremists, we have the 5% threshold, which allows our parliament to be protected against extremists. In fact, it's been argued by the electoral report that electoral review that we recently had, that should have been reduced to 4%. Other people say 3%. The concern is much more that it's too hard for minor parties to get into parliament, rather than that we're getting too many fringe parties. The combination of this 5% threshold and the fact that it doesn't apply to a party that holds an electorate seat is something that's a wee bit tricky and drives some of the strategic voting. It's one of the areas which has been recommended that we relook at, but that hasn't happened as yet. So the issue of the Queen makers. This is a little quip that came up on Facebook and was shared widely following the last election. There were some people who argued that it wasn't fair that National didn't get to form the government when they had the most seats in Parliament. And our leader of the New Zealand First Party, Winston Peters, has often been styled as a kingmaker. It's not exactly true, although he does play this up in the lead up to elections, and that he won't choose before going into the election, and that's part of his electoral strategy. But as I mentioned, United Future, for example, took the opposite approach. So basically, if you have, what's a Kiwiana expression, if you have one mince and cheese pie in the shop and it costs $5, and Bill had only $4.50, he and the others had lesser amounts. Bill couldn't buy the pie, and no one else could buy the pie by themselves either. But the people who could club together and get $5 could buy the pie. So on the issue of party hacks, just going quickly through some of the remaining, so we've got time for a few questions. Each party is able to determine how it will order its party list in New Zealand, and the Greens are the only party that uses a democratic process involving all party members voting on the order. There has been an increasing professionalisation of politics, and many leading politicians have come through parliamentary members' offices prior to going into politics. But this is a theme in countries, similar countries that don't have an MMP system as well. And there has not been the party hacks fear coming to fruition in terms of people who did not have a public profile and only worked in the back rooms. Politicians hoping to get elected from the list, especially, need to be high up. They generally need to have a decent public profile. Are they increasingly disconnected from constituents? It seems that the opposite is true. Whereas the electorate MPs have a geographic constituency, what we've found is many list MPs will also be given an area. So if you have a area where you haven't won your electorate, you don't just have to sit there for a whole term waiting to try again next term. Your list person who's in that area can have an office, and they can also speak for people in that area, so that if you're a constituent on the ground, you may say you're Labour supporting or Green supporting the constituent MP as national, and you feel that they're not going to get you, that you're not going to be listened to, either you're not their type of person or your issues too different, there's likely to be a choice of MPs in your area who you can approach. We also have a growth of constituencies that are constituencies of interest rather than the strict electoral constituencies. For example, one good example is the MP Louisa Wall, who introduced the same-sex marriage bill, has just announced she's not going to be standing for her electorate Manarewa in this election. She's going to only be on the list. And in her announcement, she says she'll concentrate on issues of interest to her, such as LGBTQI issues and Māori issues. So, so we have a situation where different interest groups are not necessarily forming their own parties, but are able to turn to list MPs to get their voices heard. Has coalition negotiations led to paralysis? Not really. Initially, yes, there was a period where negotiations to form a government dragged on, and that led to a frustrating interregnum period quite often. But this is no longer the case, really. In the negotiations, the members of Parliament are used to this now, and the templates, the ways in which these agreements happen, have kind of bedded in, and this can happen relatively quickly. Moreover, when it comes to getting things done, you'll remember that policy stability was one of the reasons for MMP. And so this checks and balances can be seen as a good thing. And the select committee process is also a way that there's more checks and balances. So really, it's a matter of opinion. You know, how much should a government be free to rush things through? As I said, we only have one house in Parliament, so once it's gone through and been passed, that's it. It's the law. So we don't have that check, and we need the other. We brought in an MMP partly as the other check. Do you want me to touch on COVID decision making before I wrap up, Ted, or do you want to go straight to questions?
Well, we do want to get some questions in for sure, and we have a few. Maybe you'll be able to integrate some of the COVID response into some of those. I guess that's hopefully.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's great. First of all, thanks very much. Thanks for your presentation. Lots of great information, and I'm sure that people were very keen about some of the details of the system and how it's played out very practically on the ground, especially over the 20 plus years now that it's been in place. So with that in mind, we do have quite a number of questions that are a bit more of the technical and systems basis, which is great. And there's been a bit of an ongoing discussion about the nature of lists. So closed versus open list. I'm going to ask you a question here. It was summed up quite well by Jonathan Lomas. He asked, with closed lists in MMP, there is the advantage of attracting high quality people who may not want to represent a local constituency, but disadvantage of it being perceived as limited interest operating behind closed doors. On the other hand, open lists gain the advantage of transparency, but the disadvantage of having all legislators do constituency work. So given the New Zealand experience, what are your thoughts on open versus closed lists? Has there been any push towards moving to open lists?
Not really. And I haven't understood the details of the open lists debate in Canada. In the New Zealand situation, there has been, guess that's why I mentioned that the Green Party has a situation where they choose their list, but then they take it to their party members for ranking, and they have an online voting system for that. The other political parties sort it out in different ways. Each party has to have a transparent process for sorting it out, but they can do it in their own way. And actually the transparency of the process, I guess, can be questioned on occasion. I think there's a pretty high recognition that any political system has a degree of manoeuvrings and strategy, and we haven't found it to be more so at all for MMP.
Okay, interesting. We have a question about thresholds. This one comes from Wilf. A few people have touched on it. Wilf asked, the Commission, I think, originally recommended a 4% threshold. The government at the time chose 5%. A review commission again recommended 4%. The previous national government didn't act. Do you expect the current Labour government to act on this, or maybe why haven't they?
I think they would only act on it if there was a significant push towards that, and it's one of those issues. We have MMP, it's working well enough. Unfortunately, I think that last review was the time on which it needed to be acted on. And it's possible if they get into, in the next term, it certainly wasn't a battle that they considered. Our parliamentary term's short, it's only 3 years. They didn't consider it one of their front runners this time around.
Okay, interesting. Here's a question from Sue Young. How do you respond to the criticism that the tail wags the dog, the tail being the small parties, kind of the criticism that they kind of run what's going on? This was something we got a lot of feedback on, resistance during the referendum in British Columbia.
Yeah, it definitely has not been the case here. And I think the fact that we have a system in which there are small parties further to the, if you take the binary approach, to the left and the right extremes, but there are also centrist small parties. There's nothing to prevent the two large parties forming a grand coalition if they wanted to, if they felt that minor parties had too much power. And there's not been a situation where a minor party has held the major parties to ransom in New Zealand. It's more been the issue of they've won some minor wins. There have been some things where they've put the brakes on that the major party couldn't get through. We haven't had any situations where they've done something dramatic and weird has happened because of a small party.
Maybe I'll ask a quick follow-up. If you remember, in the early days of MMP, was that ever the case? Was that ever the threat to be the case?
Yes, it was a threat to be the case, in that, there was an early coalition government that fell when New Zealand first left, or was if I think booted out after extreme provocation and kind of wanting to be from the government. That was a national New Zealand First government led by Jenny Shipley. However, I don't think it was really a wagging the dog. It was that they were opposing something. They were opposing the sale of an airport. So they were opposing a change to the status quo. I guess that's my point about them more likely to hold to stability than to be able to swing to whatever's perceived as an extreme position.
Okay. A question from Michael Bagamery, I think. Do you think it matters whether it's a federal, like in Canada, where we have national and provincial governments, and they have defined rights and responsibilities, jurisdictions? So do you think it matters whether it's a federal or unitary country, organization, state, as to, I think he's asking whether we can bring in proportional representation or whether it makes a big difference to governance?
Sure. So I don't really have the expertise to comment in detail about federal systems. I think it definitely made it easier to bring it in, that we have one system, and bringing it in New Zealand at a national level was a good way to go, because national politics gains more interest than our local politics, where that fits in with your provincial level, I can't really comment. Yeah, I don't think it makes a big difference, would be my hunch.
Okay.
Sorry, I don't think it makes a big difference to the governance. It may make a difference to the success of bringing it in.
Yeah, that's true. Of course, very different things. Okay, interesting. Brenda Oslowski asks, do you think that MPs in governing parties are less constrained in speaking out than they would have been as a member of a governing majority party under first past the post?
Very interesting question. In the New Zealand context, I might say yes, they are less constrained. However, when I look at other countries like the UK context with large first past the post parliament, you have MPs feeling quite happy to speak out against in a different voice from their leaders. So I don't know if it holds true across the world. Certainly we do have, it's not been a huge difference. We have a whipping system, but possibly they're more likely to take as I mentioned with Lewis Award, a community of interest approach and speak on that. Whereas in her previous seat of Manarewa, which is a fairly conservative Christian seat, if she was she was getting elected as a constituent MP, but it was much easier to speak to the nation on LGBTQI issues.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We have a lot of interest here on the Maori perspective and how it's, I guess, come about and been organized politically in New Zealand, how we can relate it, of course, back to Canada. A great question comes from Sim Gomery. She asks, regarding the Maori, I'm curious about how that came about. I think how they had the specific representation. And you talked a bit about how they then created their own party, but they did have their
Sure.
specific seats as well, right? In the context of Canada, the Indigenous people might not want to participate in government, which they might see as a form of selling out, since ideally they want a nation-to-nation dialogue with the Canadian government. How, I mean, was that an issue, I guess, in New Zealand, and did they have to resolve those deeper kind of philosophical issues?
Hugely an issue, and it's an area I'm really fascinated in. New Zealand's got a very different history where your treaties with First Nations tend to be with small nations and small land areas. We had a treaty which we look to as our founding document, signed in 1840, and then from the Maori have never given up, claiming that it ought to be implemented and honoured. At times it's turned into a claim of the treaty as a fraud. From the 1970s, we had a Maori renaissance, and the honour the treaty message became even stronger. Of course, there are a lot of Maori who feel that Parliament doesn't represent them. The 4 Maori seats as they were back then was because at that stage there was a property clause to get into Parliament, and Maori owned land communally. This was when it was adult male suffrage, but with the property clause. Because of communal ownership, Maori were disenfranchised. The 4 Maori seats were a sop to that. For a long time, it was holding Maori to less influence, but now they have Maori seats are done on a proportionate basis. It's important to note that anyone claiming Maori ancestry can choose whether to be on a Maori roll or their geographic general constituency roll. So you can only be on one. You don't get an extra vote, but you can choose whether you identify as Maori or not for the purposes of the election. So it's not an apartheid system. And yes, I just said this comment in the Maori language. We have one Indigenous language. It's not yet compulsory in schools. There's a big push towards that. It's taught in most schools. So in some ways, the Maori European or Maori settler thing is more similar to the Anglo-Franco thing in Canada than the, because Maori are our largest minority and they're a linguistic minority, although most are English speaking. So it's going to be a lot harder in Canada, where First Nations people are a lot more diverse and a lot smaller. In terms of the Māori Party, what then happened was another party representing the hard left and Māori interests, more radical Māori interests, was formed, called the Mana Party. So for a while we actually had 2 Māori-based parties with representation in Parliament. So it also allowed Māori to not all have to sort of speak with one voice. You know, the Māori vote will say this. It was diverse, and the Māori Party was made up of people who were more small c conservative. They wanted to conserve Māori traditions and promote Māori traditions, and they wanted to conserve a lot of other aspects of the country, which is why they were able to go with national, whereas the Mana Party would never have been able to go into a coalition with national.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, it's interesting to see the divergence there
Actually,
at a party
sorry,
level.
Ted, if I can add a couple more things. Until last week, when there was a change of leadership of the National Party, we had of our parties in Parliament, the opposition was led by 2 people with Māori ancestry. One of the co-leaders of the Greens had Māori ancestry, and the leader and deputy of New Zealand First had Māori ancestry. So the leaders of the party identified as Māori fairly broadly. In fact, Labour does not have, I mean, it just No, it does actually. Sorry, the Deputy Leader of Labour also is Maori and identifies strongly as Maori and came from a Maori seat. So yeah, so the influence of Maori is spread across the board.
Okay, interesting. I do want to change tack a little bit. We got a couple minutes left. There's been a number of questions about what basically we would call supply and support, or in other words, how long a government usually lasts. So I'll kind of just sum it up. There's been a number of questions. Can governments collapse easily? Has that ever, you may have touched on this a little bit, but just give us a summary. Has that happened in New Zealand, that a government can collapse, that a coalition collapse, you have an early election, or there's that sense of instability at all?
Yeah, it's been amazing how good at hanging on to power these politicians are. They don't tend to collapse. There have been some slight early elections, as in a few months in the early days, and that was largely down to the need for small parties to differentiate themselves, meaning they were incentivized to play up and break a coalition agreement coming up to an election. And also, I mean, I'm sure there were genuine frustrations, philosophical frustrations. They'd made promises, they hadn't been able to fulfill them. This was the time to speak out. That's not happening in the same way now. Although, I mean, we just have the situation of Winston Peters starting to, although he's part of the government, starting to say slightly different things from Jacinda Ardern about our COVID response. And I'm sure the fact we've got an election in a few months has something, is a driver for why that's happening.
Mm-hmm. That's true. Yes, there's the election coming up. It is a fixed date in New Zealand?
It's not a fixed date, but it has to be held within 3 years. And because 3 years is a short time, it's generally the full 3 years. So it's been announced, the September date's been announced for the election.
And on a similar vein, we've had a lot of questions, people wondering about the municipal level, because you don't have obviously federal, provincial, so many different layers of government. Is there any municipal PR? Is there interest or a push for that at any municipal level?
So at the local level, there's a whole variety of voting systems, which I actually won't speak too much about because I haven't looked into for this presentation. I don't want to put you wrong, but there is a variety. Much harder to get people's interest at a municipal level, and we have these great long booklets that come out where you're voting for basically your city government, your regional level. We have a regional level that deals with a few things such as environmental issues, your health board, and none of them get attention on national media because it's too regional. And it's very hard to engage people. So that at that point, more complex systems become difficult because there's already low recognition of the names, and also MMP can't work as easily because it's not as party based at municipal level. There's a lot more independence standing. So there hasn't been a mood to sort of partyize the local level, whereas the national level is basically party-based.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I'm thinking about the size of the actual physical ballot. Has that ever been an issue? If it's intimidating, you have a whole list of candidates kind of thing. Was there ever pushback about that?
Yeah, no. And that was actually this one slide that I was going to put up that I left off for time, which I'm glad I did. It's quite a simple ballot paper, and you can see examples if you Google it. You have one side of the paper is your tick for the party vote. The parties are listed with their logos. The other side is the tick for your constituent MP. And the instructions at the top say, vote once in column A and once in column B. It's not too hard at all.
Okay, good.
We don't have a great deal of spoiling of papers or, people getting it wrong. I mean, it's just likely that someone's going to get it wrong because they ticked Joe Smith and they meant to tick Joe Jones, and then they cross it out and then and do the other one, and the paper's spoiled and they didn't realise is that they're likely to get the two sides wrong. Doesn't seem to be an issue at all.
Fascinating. We get so much pushback on stuff like this that it's too complicated. People don't understand. You have these massive long ballots. It doesn't have to be the case, and we really look to New Zealand as a good example. So, Penny, thanks very much for joining us today, sharing your expertise and all the details. The history has been fascinating, and of course, taking the time early in the morning in Wellington, New Zealand. It's fascinating.
Look, it's been an absolute pleasure joining you, and really, really good luck with your campaign. I'm going to continue watching Canada with great interest.